Okay, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar with myself, John Cooper. And today we have a very special guest. We have John Perkins. As chief economist at a major international consulting firm, John advised the World Bank, United Nations, IMF, US Treasury Department, Fortune 500 corporations, and leaders of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. We're going to be talking with John about his book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, published in 2016, which is a follow-up to John's classic New York Times bestseller, which tells the story of his role as an economic hitman who coerced countries around the world out of trillions of dollars and expand what he called the corporatocracy. His books have sold more than 1 million copies, and his website is johnperkins.org. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. Sorry.
You need more time, right?
It's great to be here. We get Johns on the show. That's better than one, I think.
Two Johns are better than one, right? John, would you mind laying out your journey from being an economic hitman? Where did that start, and how did you get effectively seduced into that role?
Make a long story short, after I got out of the Peace Corps, I was recruited. I was recruited to work for a private consulting firm in Boston, a company named Charles T. Main, which was very strongly involved with the work of the U.S. government overseas. And I became an economist there, as I'd been. And I became chief economist quite quickly. Really, what I was an economic hitman. And what I was supposed to do, I had a large staff that grew over time. My job was to identify countries that have resources our corporations want, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money didn't go to the country. It went to our own corporations, big engineering corporations and companies like General Electric that produce equipment to build infrastructure projects, power plants and industrial parks, things that made big fortunes for our companies. And also helped a few rich people in those countries, the families that owned industry and commercial establishments, shopping malls and banks and so forth, but was detrimental to the middle classes and the poorer people because money was diverted from social services, healthcare and health and education and so forth to pay off the interest on the debt. And in the end, the debt wouldn't be, the principal wouldn't be paid off. And so we'd go back under the guise of the IMF and offer to restructure the loans, make it more attractive, but there had to be conditions that the country had to meet. And those were things like selling their resource, oil, or were real cheap to our corporations without environmental or social regulations, or privatizing their public sector businesses and selling them real cheap to our investors, or allowing us to build a military base on their soil, things like this. And that's what I was doing as an economic hitman. And I have to add that in a way my job was easy, to convince these presidents to accept these onerous loans because they personally benefited, as did their cronies, their friends and relatives who owned industry and who were sitting at the top of the economic pyramid. But also they knew, behind me were people we called the Jackals. And if they didn't agree to these loans, it was very likely the Jack would step in and either assassinate them or overthrow governments. And the United States has admitted to being involved in those sorts of activities, the CIA, et cetera. In Chile with President Allende and President Arbenz of Guatemala and Mossadegh of Iran and Lumumba of the Congo and Diem of Vietnam recently in 2009, Zelaya of Honduras and on. So, I'm saying to a president here, accept these conditions and get rich and help your friends get rich, or the Jackals might come in and kick you out.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. You were like the first point of contact, and you would try and coerce them and with money. And that's obviously why we have, effectively in Africa, in continents like Africa, 1% are driving around in Bentleys, and the 99% are, totally, impoverished. And that sort of shows how the levels of corruption, even, anywhere you go around the world, it's all susceptible for that level of corruption. But you're saying that if you if you weren't able to convince these leaders, these world leaders, then the next stage would be from the corporatocracy to send in the Jackals to try and take them out effectively, and then put in their puppet leader that would obviously be more easily controlled, to advance their interest. And then if that didn't work, if the security was tight enough, bodyguards and their military was loyal enough, then I guess the third stage would be what a military strike justified in the public's eyes as they're a dictator, they are gassing their people, they're killing their own people, a propaganda campaign to back that up as well. Is that the sort of the process?
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
you've described it very, very accurately. And in fact, two of my clients, President Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, wouldn't play the game. They had tremendous integrity. They did not accept these loans, and they were both taken out. Well, they, officially, or they died in private plane crashes, both of them within 3 months of each other, less than 3 months of each other, in 1981. All the indications are that those were not just airplane crashes, that they had been instituted. There's never been a smoking gun produced to prove that. But they, in a way, expected something to happen to them. They were very leery, and most of the studies that came up, other than the official U.S. government studies, indicated that those were assassinations, not accidents.
Yeah, and actually, what's really interesting in your book is that you actually, I mean, you were friends with a lot of these. You became friends. They really took you under their wing. They actually trusted you. They hung out with you. You had beers with them. They really opened up around you, which I found even more fascinating. I mean, how did that dynamic play out? I mean, was it that they just didn't understand what you represented, or did they just think they'd try and befriend you in order to somehow create a mutual understanding, so that you give them a bit more leniency within their own country's dealings? Or how did that work, and how did that make you feel?
Well, there's really, it's hard to generalize with any of these individuals, but I think if we want to try to generalize, I think you can say there's two stories. So there's one that most of the countries accepted what we did. They bought into the loans. They played the game. Places like Indonesia, Iran, which was slightly different because they already had a lot of money with oil, but there was another process there. Colombia, Guatemala, so many of these countries where I worked, the leaders just went along with it. And I'm not sure that anybody really trusted me, but they went along with it because it seemed to serve their best interest. In the two cases I mentioned, I don't think either Roldos or Torrijos trusted me, but they did understand, especially Torrijos really understood what I was doing, and he did befriend me. He was a very charismatic guy, and he loved to party, and he'd invite me to these parties, these barbecues that he held. And he said things he explained to me. He said, John, don't you know what you're really doing? And I honestly didn't at the time. Through a lot of my career, I thought I was doing the right thing, because we're taught in business school that if you want to help a poor country, you inject a large investment into infrastructure and the economy grows. And statistically, we can show that it does. But over time, I began to see how skewed the statistics were in favor of the rich. So let's take the United States today. Just take the United States. 3 individuals have as much wealth as half the bottom half, the economic bottom half of the country. If those 3 individuals are making 10% return on their investments, and the bottom half is losing 3%, you're still showing a growth, something slightly under 5% for the overall economy. So, when we say that investing this money into infrastructure helps the economy, it helps the GDP, but that's not a good measure, really. It doesn't measure overall prosperity of the country. But I didn't understand that at the beginning. I believed I was doing the right thing. And Omar Torrijos of Panama, he understood what I was doing, and he pointed out to me, he made me face this. And he also said, hey, why don't you come work for me? You won't make nearly as much money, but you'll feel a lot better about yourself. So I don't think any of them really trusted John. Most of them just played the game. And the couple that didn't play the game, they understood what was going on. And Jaime Roldos of Ecuador was a pretty formal guy. I can't say I ever got really close to him. I liked him. I respected him, but he wasn't a party animal like
Yeah.
Torrijos, who I did get to know very well personally, and he totally understood what the system was trying to do to him,
Yeah.
and he
Uh,
helped me
yeah.
understand.
He helped you understand. And I guess looking back, I mean, looking back, what would you have done? Are you grateful to have gone through that journey, or do you feel as though there was things that you would have changed if you could have gone back? I mean, obviously, the implications of what you were part of, had massive ripple effects and ramifications. But are you kind of grateful for where you are now, for that whole experience and the message that you're able to share with people?
Well, I'm very for where I am now. I always wanted to be a writer, and I've written now, published 10 books, and I love that. I love writing. I really enjoy it.
Mm.
I'm very grateful on many levels. I think a good way to answer that question is the way my daughter, who's an adult now, I have a grandson, once answered it in an interview with a magazine. They asked her, "So, do you regret what your dad did? Does he regret it?" And she said, I know he feels really badly about some of the things he did. There's no question about it. But she said, I'm grateful that because he did that, he understands the system. He did that for 10 years, and he stopped in 1981, and he spent the rest of his life trying to change that system. And he has credibility even with big corporations because of his background. So I think that's a good answer. That do I wish I hadn't done some of the things I did? There's one side of me that says, yeah, it was bad. There's another side of me that says, it really helped me understand the system, and it's a system that badly needs to be changed. And I'm grateful now to be in a position where I can speak out in favor of changing it and explain ways that we can change, that we can move from a failed system that I call a death economy to one that we can really embrace, that we could call a life economy. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, that would be absolutely fantastic if we can get into that. And you're actually, I mean, you talk about in the book, you said, it was born out of a lot of frustrations in your life. There was sort of anger with your parents and an obsession with women as well. There was that element of a young guy, young kind of virile guy that wants to get out into the world and explore as much as possible. And so from that point of view, it was easy. I guess you were quite seducible at that point because there was so much of the world that you wanted to explore and experience. And that was actually part of why you were so successful in the hiring process, I guess, right? Because they kind of exploited that within that need of yours as a young guy and, all that kind of thing.
Absolutely, John. And not just a young guy, but I was a young guy that his father taught in a boys' boarding school in New Hampshire. And I grew up on campus. So we had a house given to us on campus, and I ate a dining room with about 200 boys from the time I was around 4. And so we didn't lack any of the essentials of life, but my dad made almost no money in terms of cash. And yet I'm surrounded by very, very wealthy young men all my life, and no women. I heard these stories, and then I went to that school for 4 years. I was in high school, and all my classmates would go home on Christmas vacation, and I'd been hearing this all my life. They'd go home and they'd come back, and they'd talk about all the debutante balls they had been to, and the incredible parties on Park Avenue, New York, or in Paris, or in Buenos Aires, or wherever. And I would have spent Christmas vacation in the gymnasium by myself, the school gymnasium, throwing baskets, practicing tennis against the wall. So I had this deep desire to go out and see these places around the world and to make some money. And I was also very, very shy around women. I didn't want to be, but I never experienced them really very much. I went to this boys' school. And so when I took these tests with the National Security Agency, including on a lie detector, what I would later discover is that they identified me as someone who had these major weaknesses that I wanted money, power, and sex, and they understood this. And that was used very much to seduce me. And the person who trained me was this remarkable woman named Claudine, who I discuss in the books. And she was very aware of all of these things in my background that were used to hook me, to bring me into the system. was
Yeah,
effective.
I mean, she was the hired gun in a way. She was used, she was utilized, she was deployed to be the one that gets you involved, right? Because it wouldn't have worked if it was a guy. I guess they actually profiled, they profiled you, and they got the right person in to be the final piece in the puzzle in terms of hiring you, right?
Exactly. I was into guys. I could understand how the guy was trying to use me, man. I'd been through that. All my life I've been surrounded by these boys that were trying to get better grades from my dad and so on by
Mm,
teaching me soccer tricks and doing all kinds of things.
mm.
But women, I was very innocent. I was very naive.
Yeah, there was. I guess women have that effect on us, right? Yeah, it all goes out the window once you see a beautiful girl like that. Anything can happen, I guess. No, but that's actually really interesting. And then I wanted to talk about some of the things that you achieved in these countries. I mean, I know that you that there was. Would you mind just touching upon, for instance, maybe the Saudi Arabian in Saudi Arabia? Because I think that's a massive one. If you could,
It was a massive one.
yeah,
It was an exceptional one too,
yeah,
because we didn't have to convince Saudi Arabia to take loans. We just had to convince them how to use their money. And what happened was, it was the early 70s. Um, Saudi Arabia had led OPEC in a boycott against the United States, very, very destructive to our economy because of our participation in the wars in the Middle East on the side of Israel. And the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and a few of my patriots and said, we can't ever let this happen again. Somehow we've got to put Saudi Arabia in a position where they're not going to do this again. Figure out how. So I go off to Saudi Arabia, and I took some of my best employees with me to help me. But basically, what we did was we eventually came up with this deal with Saudi Arabia that they accepted, whereby they would guarantee that they wouldn't raise the price of oil above any limits that our oil companies weren't in agreement with. They would sell all oil for the dollar on the international market. And the dollar had just gone free. It had broken away from the gold standard in 71 under Nixon. And so here we are, and a couple of years later, the dollar is just kind of like out there floating around free. So suddenly it becomes the oil standard. And Saudi Arabia would guarantee that all oil would be sold for dollars on the international market. And there were a number of other conditions in there that were very, very favorable to us. And on the other side, we guaranteed to keep the House of Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, in power. And that agreement has continued. It's still in effect. I think it's part of what has bound these two countries under hell and high water when you come right down to it many times. So it was a very effective deal. And it was not the typical kind of deal that I was doing, because I didn't have to get Saudi Arabia to accept loans. Quite the opposite. I had to get them to use their money to help us. Oh, and I should say that, so part of the deal also was that they would invest all their oil revenues that would call petrodollars, or a large amount of them, in U.S. Treasury bonds. Those bonds would be used by the U.S. Treasury, the interest on those bonds by the U.S. Treasury, to hire U.S. corporations to essentially westernize Saudi Arabia, to build cities under the desert, essentially, and to build petrochemical plants and so on and so forth. And that's amounted to trillions of dollars over the years that's gone to U.S. corporations to help keep Saudi Arabia in our network, despite differences of policy sometimes. It was a very, very effective deal.
And military as well. I think you mentioned as well. They have to sort of use the US military as well. That's sort of based there, and that's another part of it, right? And also,
yeah, there were a number of parts of it that I didn't mention, but the long and the short of it is that Saudi Arabia would need to cooperate extensively with us, and we, on our part, would cooperate in keeping the House of Saud in power.
Right.
Yeah, it was a big deal, and they would spend a lot of money hiring U.S. companies.
Absolutely. And there was one part I found really interesting when you tell that part of the stories, that you said that you had to persuade the prince right? Because he was the final one that needed to be convinced, and obviously money wouldn't do it. But you said he had a thing for blondes, right? For Western blonde. So at that point, it required something else. You had to come up with a plan there, right?
It was a very strange, very strange on, yes. So that within the House of Saud, it was relatively what you might call democratic. Now, the country wasn't democratic, but to get the leadership of the House of Saud to agree, you had to get a lot of the different princes to agree. And there was this one who was a holdout, and it had to be unanimous. And his demands on me were basically to provide him with a beautiful blonde escort. It would be more than just an escort while he was in the United States, and might accompany him on trips, and put me in a very strange position, because what he's really asking me to do is pimp for him, do something illegal. And I certainly theoretically didn't have the funds to do that. I couldn't go out and hire some woman to service a Saudi prince, but I did have a large expense account. And so I was able to find this woman in Boston, lived on Beacon Hill, wealthy. Her husband was a pilot for a major international airline, and he was cheating on her a lot. She was very angry at him, and she met all the criteria: the Saudi prince, beautiful blonde, blue eyes, and she wanted to get back at her husband. And she didn't need a lot of money, but she didn't mind getting some extra money, which I could provide through an expense account. But she did say, I got to meet this guy, and I got to like him. I'm not just going to do this for anybody. I arranged a dinner, and they got along really, really well. She liked him. He was a very charismatic guy, and so that worked out quite well. And he eventually voted in our favor, so he went along with it.
just imagine if that date didn't work out. That would have been what would you have done then? That's incredible. No, that's fascinating story. And what actually happened after that? I think you mentioned he moved on to other women after that, but that was just all that was needed just to kind of fulfill that one, part.
When he went back to Saudi Arabia, he was insistent that she go with him.
Oh.
And that wasn't her plan. She was staying married at the time. I don't know what happened to her eventually, but and then I discovered. So I have to say, at that time, was and I don't know whether this still goes on, but I suspect it does on some level. There was this market that American corporations often struck deals with women. A lot of these women that they struck deals with were from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet nations, and they were from different places. But the corporation would tell them, look, if you go off and to Saudi Arabia or some other country for 5 years or so, we'll create a bank account for you, and every year we'll put $100,000, or this was back a while ago, so I don't remember the exact amount, but a significant amount in that account. And when you get out, you're going to have that money, and you'll be very well off. And so that was going on, and I tapped into that system and found a woman who was quite willing to go off and met his criteria too. And he was okay with that. He was not loyal to this one woman, although he did like her, but he understood, and he accepted.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this must still go on. I mean, like people like Jeffrey Epstein, he must be doing something similar, right? I mean, in terms of coercing big, high-profile, leaders and top officials and top Hollywood execs and stuff like that. I mean, this must be a currency that's still used today, right?
I don't have any current experience, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. And I sometimes wonder, what has this very strong and very necessary women's movement, how has that impacted those sorts of things? And I really don't know. I mean, I have no idea.
Yeah. It seems to me there's a lot of the world that we don't really understand. I mean, your book went a long way to showing the how the world really works, but it's the rabbit hole goes extremely deep, I think, and it's not people aren't really, some people might not even be ready for some of the truths that
yeah. And John, we do know there's people. I've been on a speaking tour with a woman who was very deeply involved in the whole idea of slavery, modern day slavery. People that are brought to the United States to be, they're told that if they come here, they'll be a housekeeper for somebody and then they'll have citizenship within a year or two. But in fact, they're just shut up in the house and they don't dare do anything because they could be deported. I mean, we hear these stories a lot. We know there's a lot of that kind of thing still going on various levels. I don't know how deeply corporations are still involved in that, but certainly that whole area of human trafficking is a big part of parts of our economy today, as I understand it, and it's a terrible, terrible situation that we allow this to continue. It's something that really needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and child trafficking as well. I think that's another huge one that people don't,
yes.
they don't understand that, but that's a massive, massive thing that goes on under the radar,
Absolutely.
But would you mind if we just touch quickly on 9/11? Because I think I've heard you before say that was actually the catalyst to writing the book. Was that right? Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah. Well, yes. And what happened was after I got out of being an economic hitman, I started to write a book about that. And I wanted to be an expose. I wanted to get the stories of a lot of other people who'd had jobs similar to mine and some of the Jackals. And so I started contacting them. And immediately I got several anonymous phone calls at night, a man's voice threatening to kill me and my daughter. My daughter was an infant at the time. I took those calls very, very seriously because I had run into these people. I knew what they were capable of, and so I was terrified. And they said, you can't write about this. Let go of this. Get out of this. And but it was beyond that because I felt that I didn't know what they were asking of me. But very soon after that, those phone calls, I got invited out to dinner by the president of Stone and Webster Engineering Corporation, another Boston-based company that had been a rival of my company's. I'd quit my company at this point, and this president took me out to dinner, and he offered me a job. He said, you've got a really good resume. You were chief economist. You had a staff of about 50 people working for you at various times, and we'd really like to use your resume in proposals. You won't have to do any work for us. Just let us use your resume. And I'm prepared to write you a check tomorrow for $500,000. Now, this was in the 80s, early in the 80s, and $500,000 was worth quite a bit more than it is today, although it's still something to laugh at. And so I was getting the same treatment in a way that I'd given these presidents of countries. I'm getting the pistol, we'll kill you and your daughter, or I'm being offered this money. And then the president says to me, of course, just don't write that book, just don't write that book. And so I'm offered a way out. And I have to say it was a big relief on the one hand, but it was also a very tough moral, ethical issue to deal with. And I'd ask you and any of your listeners, what would you do? Your infant daughter's life is being threatened, your life is being threatened, or you're being offered this large sum of money. And I took the money. In all fairness, I didn't put it toward buying a big house or fancy cars or things like this. I reinvested in my own career. I went back to the Amazon where these indigenous people had saved my life. And I said, now I want to help you save your rainforests. And as a result of all that, I formed a nonprofit called Dream Change, and eventually another one that was the Pachamama Alliance. It's now in over 80 countries. And I began writing books on indigenous people. Now, Stone and Webster, this company that hired me, was fine with me writing those books. In fact, they thought it might help their business. I was writing books about other countries, the Amazon and so forth. So I wrote 5 books on indigenous culture: Shape-Shifting, The World is As You Dream It, Psychonavigation, and 2 others. But I didn't write the book. And then on 9/11, I was deep in the Amazon, taking a group of people to study with the Shwa, these indigenous people who'd saved my life when I was in the Peace Corps and I'd been writing about. And when I got home, I flew to Ground Zero. And as I stood there looking at that pit, I knew I had to come clean on what I'd done. which isn't to say that I understood what had happened there. But what I did understand was that somehow my role in life had played a part in creating a system that's very dysfunctional and may have something to do with creating the kind of anger that caused something like 9/11. So at this point, though, I decide that I will write this book in complete secrecy. I won't tell anybody I'm writing it. I won't contact any other people. I would just, instead of an expose, I'd write a confession, a personal story, and I'd write the whole thing. And I figured once the whole manuscript is written, then I've got it in the hands of a really good New York agent, and he's getting it out to publishers. It's my best insurance policy. Because anyone who might not want that message to get out, the last thing they're going to want to do is make me a martyr, kill me, get the, that the publisher would get the message out. This guy was killed because he wrote this book, so you better buy the book and find out the real truth. Yeah. So I felt that at that point that's what I should do, and it would be my insurance policy, and that's when I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, finally, like after 9/11.
So the Jackals never got to you before it was published?
No, they didn't know it was being published. I really kept it in total secrecy, other than my agent in New York, who also kept it in total secrecy.
Wow, that's quite a job in itself, isn't it, to keep that under wraps?
Well, it really wasn't. I mean, because I'm writing, it's a confession, and I write it in what's called the narrative nonfiction. So it's all true stories, and I love to. I'm a storyteller. I'm not an essayist so much as a storyteller. I do write a newsletter once every month or so. It's a kind of an essay, but I really like to tell stories, and so it was fun for me and easy. I'd written 5 books on shamanism that were the same sort of thing. They were all sort of narrative nonfiction, and I have to say that I enjoyed writing it. It was cathartic. It raised things for me that were troubling sometimes, but in the end, it was kind of like some form of psychoanalysis. It was cathartic to get that out there. And I didn't have to contact anyone else. I didn't have to do much research because it's written as my own confession as to, what went on. I do a little research about dates and times and so on, just to confirm that things, but not much.
Yeah, it was actually interesting when I was reading the book. There's this dichotomy, there's this struggle within your own consciousness, I guess, of wanting to earn lots of money, wanting to be successful, wanting to feel powerful and be like James Bond, which effectively you were. I guess you were like the real, like, living James Bond. I guess you had that lifestyle as well. But then you were also talking from another perspective of I guess the devil and the angel on each shoulder is a little bit like the best way to describe it. And you really tell that story well, about how there was this tug of war going on in your own consciousness about what was ethically correct, but then you were kind of somehow backwards rationalizing your actions as, oh, well, this is good, it's injecting money into their economy, and this is good for Americans, this is good for the host country here. You could definitely feel that was going on throughout the book. I mean, is that would you say that was part of the catharsis for you in expelling all that and purging all that from your consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. So it was an interesting. I was only 10 years in that job, and it was only, I don't know, maybe halfway into it that I began to understand that what we were doing was not what we said we were doing, that we weren't helping raise the level of prosperity across these countries. We were just making a few wealthy people wealthier. And that looked good in the statistics and in the reports. And I write in this my latest book, Touching the Jaguar, about the importance that perception plays in molding reality. And in this case, I was selling a perception that investing this money in these countries would help everybody. And I could convince presidents using this, and they could then take it to their people. The reports that we produced that showed this. Well, once I began to understand that was a false story, it was a false perception that was creating a reality that was not beneficial to anyone, I didn't want to believe it. Because now I'm doing what I'd always wanted to do back in those days in that prep school. I was traveling first class around the world, flying first class, staying in the best hotels, eating in the finest restaurants, wining and dining with presidents and beautiful women. And I was realizing what I thought was the American dream, my dream. And so I wanted to convince myself that what the World Bank was telling me, what our what today we'd call human resource part of the company was saying, what everybody was saying, that we were doing the right thing. I wanted to convince myself that all that was true, and yet deep in my heart, I increasingly knew that it wasn't. And so there was this struggle. Well, what do? Do you believe what business school taught you and what World Bank is saying and all these very powerful, smart economists are telling you? Or do you believe what your heart tells you and what you've begun to understand? I spoke Spanish. I was spending a lot of time in Latin America. I was hanging out with Omar Torrijos. I was hearing from people the other side of the story, but I didn't want to believe it at the beginning. And over time, it became increasingly important for me to understand it. And then I had this moment of enlightenment after about 10 years in the process. And I was in the Virgin Islands, and I can go into that if you want, but in any case, it was an extreme moment of enlightenment when I realized I couldn't go on doing this, and I went back to Boston and quit.
Yeah, I mean, that's we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time because there's a lot of things I want to ask you as well, John. I mean, that's but I mean that must have been quite well, how did you feel firstly when you made that decision?
Well, once I made the decision, I was on St. John Island in the Virgin Islands, and I was sitting up in this. I was up to the top of this mountain hill, and this old sugar plantation, looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean, and it was beautiful and idyllic. And I was surrounded by bougainvillea. It was just gorgeous. But then it suddenly struck me that this whole place had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I realized, well, the whole hemisphere is built on the bones of millions of slaves, Africans and American natives and many others. And then I had to admit that I too was a type of slaver. I wasn't putting people in physical chains, but I was putting them in debt chains and monetary chains and creating this, what we call the death economy, this failing economic system. And I decided I wouldn't do it anymore. And once I made the decision, I felt incredibly relieved. And that's when I went back to Boston. And right after that, it was the first day back from vacation, I quit. And it was a tremendous sense of relief. There was also a lot of anxiety, like what the hell am I going to do now?
Yeah, I bet there is, because you're used to that lifestyle and that kind of work for 10 years, right? And so I guess it's sort of leaving you a little bit well, lost in a way. Yeah, I can see that. I wanted to ask you about the perception war, John. Is it then not possible that what we're told with 9/11 is just a perception? Because that surely, if we're using what you've explained in your book about how the public has shown one version of events and one narrative in order to push foreign interests, so then wouldn't it make sense that 9/11 was done just to expand the corporatocracy in Afghanistan and the Middle East?
I have no idea what really happened at 9/11. I have a very hard time believing the official story.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to believe, and there's so many aspects of it, the movies of the buildings falling and so on, and the seventh building and so on, whatever building number 7, whatever. And perhaps for me more than anything, to think of a guy standing in a cave in the Himalayas with a walkie-talkie guiding this operation, it's very difficult to follow to believe that whole story, that there wasn't maybe it was the guy with the walkie-talkie, maybe it was his people, but there's just so much I don't understand. And because I don't understand, I don't want to speculate, but I have a really hard time believing the official story behind it. And I think we can look at who benefited from all this. If you really look at who benefited from all this, that certainly the defense industry benefited tremendously from all of this, which isn't to say that they caused this to happen, that they were behind it. I just don't know who was behind it. But what we do know is that it did change the world, and it changed America's role in the world in a way that benefited some people, but in the long run, I think has been very detrimental to most of us and to most of the world, frankly.
Absolutely, yeah. And I like, follow the money basically is a good way to maybe get under the skin of what actually is going on, and who is going to profit from this is normally, as you say, a good way to sort of see how things are normally working.
It's another example of how there were a lot of Saudis involved, and apparently they were the Saudis in the United States, not the ones that caused the crash because they were gone, but some of the diplomats and other families were rushed back to Saudi Arabia, which goes back to that deal that we struck with the Saudis of protecting their family come hell or high water, which again is not to suggest that they did it. I don't know, but to suggest that what we did do was work to protect them and place blame elsewhere for sure.
I mean, you could also look at the current situation with the virus. I mean, from one angle, you'd say this coronavirus is started in China and now it's affecting everyone around the world. But when you look at the sort of ramifications of that, the increased surveillance, loads of money within the vaccines that's going to come from that, all these different things that have emerged in the subsequently from the outbreak, it would make you sort of think, if you were sort of using the same logic, that perhaps that was also done from the perspective of, again, the corporatocracy, advancing people's, financial interest. Could it not be?
Well, I have a really hard time believing that, John. Because I don't, it's just too much of a shotgun approach.
Yeah.
Usually my experience, at least with these maneuvers and corporatocracy things, it's much more focused on certain individuals and certain situations. This is impacting everybody in the world. But what I do think is really significant about the coronavirus is that it's obviously going to change us forever. And it probably needs to. I've talked for a long time about how we need to transform the death economy into a life economy. And we've been getting signals for a long time that the current system isn't working. The glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, species extinctions are growing at accelerating rates, income inequality is rampant. And we've been getting all these messages, more hurricanes, more earthquakes, more fires, et cetera. We haven't really listened, and all of these events have seemed fairly localized. Now we've got an event that's global. It's impacting everybody. And it's teaching us a lot of things about ourselves. It's teaching us that we can do a lot more of this kind of broadcast, that we can communicate this way. I just recently had a board meeting with 12 other or 11 other board members. And, we usually meet in San Francisco, and I live on an island off the coast of Seattle, and I'm here, and nobody flew to get to this meeting or drove cars to get to the meeting. And then we included over 200 of our top supporters from all over the world came into the meeting for an hour. So it's amazing. And we've been doing a lot of this kind of stuff. So, and people are shopping online, and it's absolutely going to change us. There's no question about it. And it's changes that I think needed to come. It's unfortunate that it's coming at such a large cost, human cost and economic cost, but we needed to be, I think we needed to get that slap in the face, and we're getting it. And hopefully we're really going to listen, and we're going to understand that we need to move into a new economic system.
And actually, let's talk about that then, John, because let's talk about what you go into as a new paradigm for, I guess, community, right? Community and personal growth and creativity and all that kind of stuff. You call that the life economy. Do you want to just touch upon that and how we can move into that?
Yes. So, you talked about wanting to be face-to-face, good contact. I think we'll move more perhaps into getting to know our neighbors better locally, and doing these things like board meetings and other conferences and meetings more this way. So I think the two can come together. I think one of the disadvantages of these technologies in the recent past has been that people have been becoming friends with people all over the world more and not getting to know their neighbors that well, and then periodically fly off or drive off to meet with some of these people. I think so those sorts of things will change. The death economy is an economic system that actually is destroying itself, and it's been growing over the years, but it's really took off in the last 20 years or so. It's an economic system that ravages the very resources upon which it depends. It's based on a perception, a goal that the sole responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. That's a ridiculous goal. But it was strongly voiced by Nobel Prize winning Milton Friedman back in 1976. And that moment changed everything in terms of how we define the goals of business. And the goals of individual maximize short-term benefits. That had been growing. It wasn't that Friedman just suddenly came out of nowhere. And this whole thing had been growing, but Friedman became an advisor to Reagan, and he was very highly respected as an economist. It's been growing ever since, and it's created an economic system that doesn't work. All of the crises that we're facing today, whether it's climate change or income inequality or even terrorism and now the coronavirus, they can see that their roots are in this system. They are symptoms of a system that's not working. The alternative to that is to change the perception, no longer maximize short-term profits, instead maximize long-term benefits for people, and let that be the drive force, maximize long-term benefits. That means you can pay investors a decent rate of return, not these huge rates of return, decent rate of return to pay people to clean up pollution, to generate destroyed environments, to come up with new farming techniques, sustainable farming techniques, and all new technologies that recycle, that create energy out of the air, that use the sun and wind much more effectively even than we're doing it today. Back not too long ago when I was in the business, solar energy was costing something like $66 for a kilowatt, and now it's down to 66 cents. So we've made huge progress, but we can make a lot more progress. And so we can move into this life economy, and it's an economic system. It doesn't mean we're going to move back into cave, quite the contrary. It's a beautiful opportunity for us to move into a much more beautiful way of living and relating to each other and connecting on this planet and doing things that we feel really good about for ourselves and our children and grandchildren. And incidentally, John, it's what the indigenous people have always had. We all come from indigenous people. If you look at humanity, as human beings, we go back about 250,000 years. And almost all of that time we've lived in a life economy until the last few years. And you could say maybe it goes back a couple of thousand years, but really the major shift has been since World War II. And increasingly in the last 10, 20 years, we've just moved radically in this direction of this very selfish-oriented economic growth model.
Yeah.
Right. And this whole, I just got this yesterday, actually. It's finally out, and if you look at the subtitle, I don't know whether you can see it or not.
Yes.
Touching the Jaguar, transforming fear into action to change your life and the world. It's about this. So in the Amazon, they say that when you're on a vision quest or a shamanic journey, you see a jaguar, it means that there's something out there that you fear. And it's usually about change. It's something you should be doing. You know you ought to do, but you can't quite bring yourself to do it because you fear it. If you run from that, the jaguar chases you. If you touch the jaguar, it helps you transform that fear into action to change your life and in fact the world. And so what we're looking at now, for example, with this economic model we're talking about is if we take so we mold reality through our perceptions, and if we have the reality that Earth has a lot of human and natural resources, perception, we have to maximize the short-term profits from using those resources. We come to a death economy. If we take those same resource, that same first reality, the Earth has a lot of human and natural resources, we change the perception and we say, these must be used for the long-term benefits of everyone, including renewing those same resources, regenerating, renewing them. Then we reach a life economy. Standing on what we call a perception bridge between these two is a jaguar. And it says, but do we really dare change? I mean, you and I, John, and probably most of your listeners know that we got to change. We shouldn't be driving so much. We shouldn't be doing whatever. There's a lot of things. Every one of us can name things that we know we probably shouldn't be doing as much as we do. And this coronavirus, in fact, in some respects, is forcing us not to do some of these things. But on that bridge is this jaguar that says, well, wait a minute. if I really buy into this, does that mean I can't go to Latin America again? I spend a couple of months a year there in the Amazon and places. I take groups of people. It's on my website. If some of your listeners want to come. But so do I really want change? Because does that mean I won't be able to do what I love to do? And half the world can't even consider change because they're just worried about putting food on the table for the next meal for their kids. And then you get these people at the top of the economic pyramid. They don't want change because they think they got it made, they get the power, they get the money. So there's this fear of change. But what we realize is that if we touch that Jaguar and say, hey, we're talking about moving from a terrible economic system that isn't working to one that is working and that will really be very lovely, where we're paying ourselves to clean up the plastic that's floating around in the rivers of Europe and in the Pacific Ocean and many other places, to regenerate old mine pits and all kinds of destroyed environments. We'll pay people to do this. We'll pay companies to, instead of making war equipment, to make methods that will clean up the environment, that'll mine the plastic in the oceans, that'll regenerate. We're going to get into a whole new way of looking at what it means to be human on this planet. And this virus now is giving us a kick in the butt to say, yeah, it's time to do that. Move forward. Transform that fear into action to change your life and the world. And in the book, I take people through a whole process that each individual can use, regardless of whether you're a writer like me or a podcast host like you, or a carpenter or a plumber or a teacher or a parent. There's a little process that you can do for 10 minutes. You can do it every day, or you can do it every few days or once a week or whatever, but it's a process of really identifying what do you really want in your life? And how will that also impact other people around you in a positive way? And what are the Jaguars standing in your way? What are the voices telling you, hey, you're not educated enough, you're not good, you don't look right, you don't have the talent, you don't have the time, you can't do that. What are those Jaguars? And you identify the Jaguars and then you touch them and say, but I can take the time. I can get up a half an hour earlier every morning and do the writing that I want to do or whatever it is. And then what actions do I take to make that happen? So there's this whole process that we can go through. And I think, to me, that's in a way the crux of this book, although there's a lot of what I think are fun stories leading up to that point.
If it's as interesting as the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I think people are in for a real treat with that, and especially that really would resonate with you guys watching this, especially with the idea of transformation, creating change, creating positive change, and also, I guess, looking at your own limiting beliefs, right, and your own demons, and touching the Jaguar on the head with those.
When you look at this, isn't she beautiful? I mean, so and actually, as I was writing this book about a year ago, I was kayaking down a river in the Amazon and nearly crashed into a beautiful Jaguar swimming across.
Oh, did you really? Oh my God!
Jaguars love water. They're one of the few cats that do. I came around this bend and there's this Jaguar swimming across the river, full-grown adult Jaguars. It's like a great message. They're beautiful animals, and they are scary in a way, but they also give gifts. They truly do. There's many stories in the Amazon about how a hunter out in the forest, an indigenous hunter, may break his leg or something and be dying and starving, and a Jaguar will come up and leave him some food, kill an animal and bring him. There's so many stories of things like that you gotta believe them. When you hear that many stories around animals, it's a beautiful, beautiful animal. And but we've each got our own Jaguars to touch.
We've each got
to give us gifts.
Absolutely. And you've given us a great gift today, John. So, thank you so much for coming on. And I implore people to do follow that path of shamanism and follow that path of self-exploration. And then hopefully you can bring your gifts out into the world, as John's talking about here, and make the world a better place. So I think that's kind of a wrap, John. I'd just like to say thanks again for coming on. I mean, your story is quite incredible. And thank you so much for writing it out into a book and being brave and taking that chance, and showing the world that there's actually a much healthier path to lead, one of joy, one of hope, one of creativity, one of passion. And I think that it couldn't be more beautiful than that. So from everyone here at Raising the Bar, John, thank you so much again, and take care and all the best.
Thank you. My pleasure, John. And keep up your great work. It's so important what you're doing. I deeply appreciate what you're doing of bringing these messages out. Thank you.